All right, good morning, good afternoon. Thank you to everyone for joining us. We're going to go ahead and get started with our spotlight panel for today, media and AI. I'm Matthew Weber. I'm an associate professor at Rutgers University in the School of Communication and Information. I'm really excited to have everyone here today. I'm going to start off with a couple quick procedural notes, and then I'll introduce our panel. After I introduce our panel, I'm going to hand it over to each of our panelists for a 3 to 5 minute introduction in which they're going to each give their perspective on the role of AI technology in the production and distribution of news media today. And then we'll move on to our discussion portion of the panel, where we will start with a few initial questions that I've asked all the panelists to think about. And we'll then open it up to Q&A from the audience. So procedurally, two things to note. You'll see the chat functions enabled. I would ask for chat that we use that for comments that general comments, general remarks that you want to share with other audience members, any information that you think would be helpful for those who are interested in this topic. But for specific questions that you have, I would ask that you put those into the Q&A feature, and that way we'll be able to track the questions and make sure that as we get to the open Q&A, we're responding to your questions. So with that, the goal of our panel today is to tackle the ambitious challenge of examining and poking at the intersection of emerging artificial intelligence technology and the production of news media and online environment. And in order to do that, we're very fortunate to have an incredibly distinguished and diverse panel that we've brought together today. So I'll start with Rory Cellan-Jones, who is BBC's chief technology correspondent and reports on print, online, and audio on a whole host of topics related to our discussion today. Second, we have Andrea Guzman, who is recently tenured Associate Professor of Communication, congratulations, at Northern Illinois University, and a scholar who studies human-machine communication and audience on people's perceptions of artificial intelligence. Our third panelist is Cameron Hickey. Cameron is the director of the Algorithmic Transparency Institute at the National Conference on Citizenship. His work leads an effort to develop methodologies and tools for collecting and analyzing data in order to increase transparency regarding how large digital platforms impact our society at large. And lastly, but not least by any means, we have Amanda Stent, who is the NLP architect in the data science group in the office of the Chief Technology Officer at Bloomberg. In addition to her work at Bloomberg, Amanda has had a wide range of prior research experience, including being previously the director of research and principal research scientist at Yahoo Labs, time spent at AT&T Labs, and as well as time spent at Stony Brook University. So first, let me say thank you to our panelists. Thank you for being here this morning, this afternoon, depending on where you're located. And with that, I'm going to go in the order that I introduced the panelists, and I will turn first to Rory for a brief introduction on his perspective.
Hi, everybody. Very honored to be here. Slightly overawed by the credentials of everybody else on this panel compared with me. I am what you might call an old hack who has been reporting on technology for the last 14 years, but working in the news media for nearly 40 years. And I've been reflecting when I realized this was not about how the media covers AI, but how the media, how media organizations might use AI and be transformed by AI. I reflected on definitions and how much what we assume about what AI is. I thought back to the first newsroom that I was in, which was an incredibly analog newsroom in the BBC in Leeds in 1981, where we still shot on film and had to wait for the film to go through the processing bath for 40 minutes. It was a newsroom full of typewriters and smoke, where the news editor disappeared at lunchtime downstairs, where we had a full bar and had 2 pints of beer, which kept him going. We were, of course, even when I then moved to the the main London newsroom a couple of years later, we still were pretty analog. We had video, but we had a newspaper cuttings library, which was how we researched a lot of information, with teams of researchers basically cutting up the newspapers and filing them into what you might call a giant Yahoo style directory. The graphics were on cardboard, so that animating a graphic involved actually pulling out a piece of cardboard physically to reveal what was beneath. So incredibly old-fashioned and employing large amounts of people. And in fact, 2 years after I got into that job, we brought computers. Well, my organization tried to bring computers into the newsroom, and to my slight embarrassment, I was one of many who was called out on strike by the union over the very idea of using computers. As a technology correspondent, that is, something slightly embarrassing. So compared with today, if I look back with my 1981 eyes at today, I would think that artificial intelligence had taken over news. Most of the jobs involving recording, editing, and so on are now done by one person rather than 5. Computers penetrate every area of the news operation. Rather than having a stopwatch timing everything, an automatic program times a news bulletin and basically stops it going over time. Instead of all those people cutting up bits of paper, we have an automated system. We have something called Google, and we also have, instead of news editors that know what's an important story, because they've got they will tell you that their Auntie Nellie will be interested in it. We have huge amounts of data coming in all the time on what people are clicking on, what age they are, and what impact changing a headline, even by a couple of words, will do to that story. You could see what we have now as an intelligent newsroom. Looking back to 1981, I would have seen that as, an artificially intelligent newsroom, but I'm not sure we define it as that. We are seeing AI coming in all sorts of areas. I think, for instance, my life's been transformed over the last couple of years by something called Otter, which transcribes every interview I do. Obviously, it's something that has come on in leaps and bounds in the last 5 years. We're getting simple stories in some areas written by programs, simple sports stories and commodity stories, not at the BBC yet, I have to say. But that is obviously going to spread. We've got programs that can scan, we're looking at programs that can scan huge documents and maybe spot the vital information in them, helping, the new breed of data journalist. I want one of those programs to scan my 5,000 emails about NFTs every day and cryptocurrencies and delete all of them. We've got deep fakes, which are beginning to make themselves felt. We've got simulation. I, for instance, am coming to you from the Four Seasons Total Landscaping venue, which became famous last year. So we are beginning to see these AI techniques come in and transform the way we work. But to my mind, we can get overexcited by this. We can get distracted from the key things about news that still matter. The fact and central to that is something that's been huge over the last couple of years: the battle over facts and truth. And I think we've got to be very careful about relying on machines rather than humans to make decisions, relying too much on stats, relying too much on data rather than human editors making judgments. So I would say some of the essentials haven't changed, but AI is beginning to have an impact on every journalist's life.
All right. Thank you, Rory. I'm going to hand things over now to Andrea.
Hello. First of all, I'd like to thank Matt for inviting me to be part of this panel. For the organizers of the conference, this is my first WebSci, so I'm very excited to be a part of this. I am a former journalist, or maybe recovering journalist is the best way to put it. I was a print journalist back in the early 2000s, working for a Hollinger-owned publication. So I won't dredge up any more memories of Hollinger, but yes, so I was there during the transition from, more of the analog into the digital. And now I work in more research spaces. The focus of my research is this area that's called human-machine communication. And here, we're not just looking at technologies as tools through which we communicate, but we're looking at processes and technologies that are designed with increasing agency to act on behalf of humans or to directly interact with them, and how they become inserted into different communication processes. So my research focuses mainly on disembodied artificial intelligence and how people conceptualize and think about technology that communicates with them. So the Siris and Alexas of the world, but also automated, journalism technologies, particularly technologies that quote unquote write the news, that create stories for the audience. And I'm really interested I'm more audience focused in my research on how the average person makes sense of artificial intelligence and make sense of technology in these roles. And I look at this from the relational perspective, not in terms of the big R relationship, will artificial intelligence be my friend? But when we insert these technologies into the newsroom, for example, how do journalists such as Rory come to see them within the flows of communication? How do they understand them? Do they think they help, they hurt? And then from, the audience perspective, how do they make sense of this idea that, a technology may be, quote unquote, writing or fashioning a story for them? And of particular interest is ethics. And so this question of, not so much should we be doing this, although those questions are important, but really, in what ways should we be doing this? And what ways should we be integrating these technologies? And, who is making these technologies? In what ways may these technologies, have problematic aspects through design, or, if we're talking about data journalism, through training data, and thinking about issues of inequity, and thinking about who they're serving. Are they serving the audience? Are they serving to help the journalist? Or are they serving to help big corporations? And so, I look at these very complex factors. And what I bring to this is, although I am a former journalist and I study journalism, I also study people's conceptualizations of AI more generally. And one thing I think it's really important for us to think about working in media industries is that, the audience doesn't just interact with this idea of artificial intelligence, when they're interacting with whatever product journalists may be creating, right? They have, these voice assistants in their homes. They may be working in an environment where AI is coming into their own organization. And so when people make sense of these technologies, yes, there is a journalism context, but they bring a lot of this other baggage about AI. Including all that baggage from science fiction. Doctor Who is, coming in there as well. And so it's, looking at these larger complex factors. And I'm looking forward to having a discussion with this panel. So thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. All right, I'm going to hand things over to Cameron now.
Thank you, and I'd like to echo everyone else's thanks for having me here. I'm really excited to participate and to hear from all the other panelists as well. I am also a journalist. I am not a practicing one anymore. I don't like former or lapsed or recovering, because I think journalism is something that's sort of in your DNA. I think as a journalist every day, even if I'm not necessarily writing new stories or shooting new television production. I spent a long time at the PBS NewsHour, not as long as Rory has at the BBC, but I come at this as a journalist, and I've spent the last several years focused on how to use technology specifically to understand how algorithms impact our lives, with a particular focus on mis and disinformation. So following the 2016 US election, that's an area that has seen tremendous growth, both in terms of the coverage of it and in terms of the various institutions that have mustered a new focus on how do we understand how algorithms impact the spread and amplification of mis and disinformation. And what I recognized is that we lacked the tools and the infrastructure to do that work. So the institute that I run is particularly focused on making tools that are accessible to researchers, to newsrooms, and to civil society organizations that want to understand the role of mis and disinformation in our discourse. And for the most part, my focus is on how these algorithms impact that. And so when I think about AI and its relationship to our access to news and information, I really think about the algorithms that drive the social media platforms that choose what everyone is seeing. So regardless of what a journalist may produce, and journalist in the loosest possible definition of that term, today, the vast majority of audiences are receiving the information that they consume via decisions made by black box algorithms. That varies from platform to platform. I'm particularly focused at the moment on TikTok, which is a platform where the algorithm and the recommendation system, which is built on top of kind of artificial intelligence, is the interface. Every single piece of content you experience on that platform was delivered to you by an algorithm that chose what you should see based on the decisions that you've made previously. And what we're observing through our research and the investigations that we do with lots of different partners is that those algorithms are the sort of next generation of the fire hose, right? And we used to talk about the fire hose if we thought about Twitter or Facebook as like this massive flood of information. But now I think about the fire hose in the sort of like cartoon representation of it, which is like a giant hose with, thousands of gallons per minute of water flowing out that no one can control. And it's flailing all over the place, because now we've developed these really powerful algorithms that do a great job of making recommendations, which are really predictions based on past behavior. But those recommendations aren't really controlled by anyone, and they have really wild and dangerous impacts on our discourse. And so when I think about how AI is influencing us, it's really about not necessarily the production, which I think there are a lot of interesting concerns there, but about the consumption side. I should say that as we look at the spread of mis and disinformation, one of the key concerns starts to be about, the kinds of things that Rory mentioned and a little bit Andrea as well, in terms of how AI produces information, whether it be deep fakes or automated or simulated conversations. Because in the world of mis and disinformation, we're increasingly recognizing that we're near that tipping point. Like, we aren't there today, but we will be there in the near future. Anyone who's looked at the output of OpenAI's GPT-3 tool recognizes that we're inches away from people weaponizing the power of AI to flood all of our information ecosystems with nonsense or motivated nonsense that will cloud our ability to sift fact from fiction on a scale that we don't have today. On the other side, we look at how do we address these problems of mis and disinformation and the ways in which AI is employed to try and address those problems. So platforms like Facebook or YouTube or TikTok are attempting to use automated systems to identify the difference between high quality and low quality content, legitimate content, illegitimate content, factual and non-factual content. The reality is, at the moment, what we see is those tools are somewhat good at helping human moderators to identify the top level of stuff, but they aren't good at all at doing anything else in the removal of that content. Sadly, they're really, really good at sending more of it to us. We've done lots of experiments where we can easily see that if you make a few decisions on any platform about the kind of content that you want to consume, and that content is problematic in some way. Let's say, for example, it's content that shares, the stop the steal big lie about the 2020 US election, or it shares vaccine hesitancy disinformation. The platforms almost instantaneously are ready to recommend more of it, to produce that proverbial rabbit hole that we've all become so familiar with and afraid of. So we're at the moment, I think, at a sort of precipice where we're weaponizing and enabling AI technology to really create tremendous harm in our consumption. And we're not yet at the point where we're able to wrangle that gigantic, uncontrollable fire hose in ways that have positive impact on our news and media ecosystem. And so with that, I'm really scared, but I'm excited to talk about it.
All right, and we'll hand things over to Amanda.
Great. It's lovely to meet all of you, and I'm so excited to be on this panel. I have a lot of respect for the BBC R&D group as well. So thank you, Lucy. Let me tell you a little about the Bloomberg newsroom and how Bloomberg does news. Bloomberg provides 24/7 news around the world through TV, radio, print, and social media, and for our clients in our terminal, which is our core product, and our enterprise data feeds. We provide our own news. We have one of the larger newsrooms in the world. And we also aggregate news from hundreds and thousands of other news providers for our clients. This news is based on and intended to allow people to make sense of the over 150 billion market messages that happen every day. None of our clients, none of us could make sense of 150 billion data points a day. So what we try to do with our news is help clients to find, that's through search, through natural language search, AI-backed search, surface, that's knowing what you're interested in, and in our case, our clients tell us what they're interested in, surface and synthesize, that's make sense of market-moving events and things that are likely to move the markets. We use increasing amounts of AI to do this. We use AI to cluster and summarize news stories by event to help clients synthesize and gather perspective. We use AI to filter and enrich stories, both to enable search, for example, tagging by entities or tagging by topics, and for signal generation. That's if you have enriched a whole bunch of news, a time series of news, with information about what companies are mentioned, then you can construct an actual time series of, for example, the frequency of those mentions or the sentiment of those mentions, and you can use that to generate signals about what is likely to change in the markets. We use AI for question answering over news and search over news, and we use AI for news story production for very low latency news alerting. So we write more than 5% of our news by machine today and an increasing amount every year. All of this is aimed at helping our clients manage this ginormous flood of information that several of the other panelists have talked about. Our clients have a huge amount of data coming in at any given time. When I go to see them in their offices, they will have 6 or 12 computer monitors all arranged, and each computer monitor will have 4 or 8 windows on it, and they're trying to scan that all the time and make sense of it. So we're trying to help them manage this flood of information and make decisions, high precision decisions, that's very accurate decisions, in a very low latency environment. Because our clients are competing with the automated trading systems effectively. So their added value is what we try to help them get. So they need AI to sort, summarize, and highlight content to help them make decisions and form goals. We have research papers about much of this research at tech@bloomberg.com. This is from a technology perspective, not a journalism perspective. And we also have white papers from a finance quant perspective at tech@bloomberg.com for those of you who are interested. And I am tech positive. I do understand the potential issues around misinformation and disinformation. In the context of Bloomberg, we think and hope that our journalists, all our stakeholders, our journalists, our technologists, and our clients work together to collect intelligence from news that's coming in and to combine it with other sources of information so that they can make decisions effectively.
All right, thank you, Amanda. So I've got a couple questions for our panelists, but at this point, I'd also say if there are questions from the audience, please use the Q&A channel and start posting those so that we can start queuing those up. And depending on time, we'll start working our way through those questions. As you've been paying attention, we've hit on a number of buzzwords that are really central to the field right now: cryptocurrencies, deepfakes, NFTs, misinformation, disinformation, black boxing of algorithms, natural language processing, and the automation of news production. And we've come at this from a variety of perspectives, which I really appreciate. So I'm going to jump down my question list a little bit based on the opening remarks. And I want to ask our panelists to think about what it means today, if we accept the notion that we've been living in a post-truth era. What does reporting in a post-truth, post-COVID-19 era look like from your vantage point in this AI-enabled technological environment? And I'm happy to take volunteers to tackle that first. I see Rory's hand up.
Unmute the great cry of 2020, 2021. Yeah, I was really interested in what Cameron said about the real impact, and he's obviously right, being on consumption rather than more than on production. But I thought he was perhaps a little too depressed about what can be done about this. So I've spent a lot of the last year looking at, for instance, conspiracy theories about a lot of them about technology, about the idea that 5G can cause the coronavirus. It's got some connection with the coronavirus. And we at the BBC have adopted what I don't suppose you'd call it a technology solution. We've adopted a people solution. We've assembled a team of disinformation specialists, which is kind of a new specialism, who have been quite successful in every day, hunt down what is out there in terms of misinformation, particularly about the coronavirus, but on a range of other things, and succeed in putting out material that is, illuminating and debunking a lot of these theories. And that is basic. It's coming back to basic journalism. And I think we're winning, if that's not too big a claim to make, because for all the talk about how rapidly this material is being disseminated and the automation of it, here in Britain, certainly, at the beginning of the pandemic, when people predicted, for instance, how many people would be vaccine hesitant, it was thought that about 2/3 of UK population would be pretty willing to have the vaccine, and 1/3 would be pretty vaccine hesitant. And it's turned out that the acceptance of the vaccine has been much, much higher. And in fact, you could say that some of the reporting has exaggerated the impact of, for old-fashioned reasons, that people are more interested in conflict and alternative views in some ways than people saying a vaccine works. Some of it may have exaggerated the importance and the impact of that disinformation. I think old-fashioned journalistic methods have worked to some extent in combating this this kind of automated flow of nonsense.
Cameron, I'll let you respond, pick up the gauntlet.
Yeah, so I think that the 2020 was a really rough year in the world of mis and disinformation, right? It was the roughest, I think. And a lot of effort was poured into journalism, into research, and into work on the civil society side to address the risks of mis and disinformation. A whole lot of money was spent by nonprofits and others, and some great journalism came out of it, for sure. The BBC among them. I work with Cheyenne, who does a lot of the coverage of that for the BBC. And I think that when we look back after the inauguration here in the US, the key thing that we in the community of people investigating, researching mis and disinformation felt was, if we were to say the goal of the work was to ensure Trump didn't get reelected, not that that was mine, but I think for a lot of people who poured money in, that probably was, then maybe you could call it a success and things weren't as bad as you had hoped. But if instead your goal was to avoid violence, then January 6th really said we failed, and that's really how I felt about where we are at the moment. I would certainly agree that the current state of vaccine hesitancy and the role that misinformation has played in that may have been overplayed at this point, because we are seeing, at least in certain parts of the US, really great adoption of the vaccine. But if you look at the latest New York Times map of how the percentage of those vaccinated across the United States, it has an eerie resemblance to the political map from the 2020 election, and a painful resemblance to news media consumption patterns, right? And so that certainly suggests that the role of misinformation in the use of the vaccine has some potential correlation. And so that, I think, leaves us with a lot of lingering concerns. I'll pause there because I see Andrea has a comment, and I'd like to hear what some of the others have to say.
Yeah, thank you, Cameron. Well, I was listening to both Rory and Cameron speak. So Reuters, to make sure we have all the big groups, Reuters Institute has put out its digital news report. And there they were really looking a lot at trust in media, credibility gaps, and I think one thing we need to keep in mind is that in many instances, this is very country and culturally specific. For example, the report found that the media in a lot of places did a great job on reporting on the coronavirus, and enough to the point where it actually repaired some of the loss of trust in the media. But for example, not in the US. So in the US, we still have extremely low, it's at 29%, I think is what they were reporting. So I think we really need to think about, cultural contextual factors here. But I also think when we're talking about misinformation and disinformation, in particular, when it comes to journalism, we have to think about the outside actors, right, who are putting out that misinformation and disinformation to groups that may be now completely outside the larger mainstream media environment. And so, we may have these corrections, happening, by the BBC or, other organizations, but those people aren't going to see it. And, to Cameron's point, when we're talking about, TikTok, we are in such a not divided, but, people have their streams of media, and we're also talking in specific age groups. And so, here we need to think about, cultural context. We need to think about outside actors versus, what are we doing and how are we using technology inside mainstream news. But then, to Cameron and others' point, there's also these other, sources of information that are, completely going around all the way. So yeah, and Amanda, I saw you had your hand up as well.
Well, thanks, Andrea. Those were really compelling points. Not only was 2020 a year of tremendous amounts of misinformation, but it was a year of tremendous amounts of information. I can't think of a pandemic that was as well studied and tracked in real time as COVID-19. I can't think of an election that was as well studied in real time and reported in real time as the last election. And the market volatility was insane, like just like insane, but still reported in real time. So the fact that we can now go every day and even within the day and see the number of COVID cases in many countries and the number of COVID deaths is just extraordinary. I think the age of AI misinformation is just dawning. So Cameron is exactly right that there is a huge amount of trouble ahead. Right now, the trouble is mostly machines redistributing things. That said, on either side of the misinformation gap, there are humans. Some human decides that it is their goal to create and spread mis or disinformation. And some humans consume that. And if we can, so I don't want to not blame the AI because the AI does transmit it and will increasingly generate it. But the ultimate responsibility is on us as humans to make sure that we are educating and growing voting pools around the world and communities around the world, citizens around the world who understand how to source information, how to track information, how to find evidence for information, what trustworthy means, and that we provide computer-aided tools to help them do that. I hate to say blockchain, but ways to say that evidence is based on fact and that you can track it back to a source. These types of things we can do to help humans deal with misinformation and to help remove mis and disinformation from the internet.
Thank you, Amanda. And if you're playing Web Science Bingo and you hadn't checked off blockchain, we've got that in there as well. I actually want to pick up on the point that Amanda was just making about the human role in all of this. And we've got two really great questions from the audience that get at this. So I'm going to start with Steve's question. Steve commented that he recently read about problems IBM has been having with deploying AI into healthcare. Healthcare is a great example as a formal, well-defined body of knowledge. It's useful for AI applications, but the IBM report, and I'd seen the same report, talked about the challenge of capturing the tacit knowledge that doctors and nurses have, that they hold in their heads. So for this panel, Steve is wondering, is there, where there is such a fire hose of data processed by artificial intelligence, have you considered the role of the journalist's instinct in interaction with AI in terms of filtering through and developing stories, developing the journalistic output? And I suspect we've got some useful perspective on that.
I'm not quite sure what is being asked there, about how you integrate the journalistic instinct with it. I mean, I was kind of arguing that over my many decades in journalism, that there's, in some ways, news editors have lost that confidence, that kind of, which you could call arrogance. All the editors I knew worked for in the early days certainly knew what was a story, and these days they are confronted with journalists saying, you may say that that's not a story, look at the clicks, we've got instant feedback. So I'm not quite sure that it feels to me like there'll be a constant battle between journalistic instincts and the AI approach. It's difficult to see how they come together. They're going to be more in conflict, I would have thought.
I would, yeah, just to add to that, point to Lucy's comment at the top that she had made about Mariana Spring as an example of a BBC reporter who's doing a fantastic job of reporting on social media and misinformation. And then I'd also point back to Amanda's earlier example where she was talking about seeing the 6 different screens that you have to navigate through and various streams of information to bring that into some coherent perspective. And I would take the question that Steve is asking to be, how does a journalist do that? What is the role of journalistic instinct? And is that being diminished by AI? And Rory, it sounds like you're arguing yes. But are there examples where the journalistic instinct, the journalistic role in developing the story is being amplified or emphasized because of the effect of artificial intelligence? Amanda.
I listening to these panelists and thinking about my various experiences at news organizations, including Bloomberg and Yahoo, I think the most pernicious influence on journalism today is not AI in the sense of helping to understand or generate news. It's the simple tracking for advertising that drives the clickbait, that drives a lot of the other things. So if we're gonna regulate somewhere or focus our efforts on somewhere, it should be to find alternative funding mechanisms for news organizations so that they are not reliant on clicks and advertising, and so that they have a better way to assess the impact of the journalism that's happening. That's perhaps somewhat unrelated to AI, but with respect to bringing the journalist view in, we, again, at Bloomberg, we write an increasing amount of our news automatically. A computer can easily figure out what's happening, that a market is changing, that a company is going to be bought. What a computer cannot figure out today is why. I think the journalist's instinct and their influence is on one way of a journalist's instinct and influence affecting the news is to look at a thing that's happening and say, that is high and that surprises me. Why? And then to explain why to the reader. That's a thing that only a journalist can do today.
Yeah, Andrea.
Yeah, so I think it goes back to thinking, so often we think of technology as a tool, right? That we use to do something. And now when we have, this idea of automation or artificial intelligence, it's acting on its own. So one thing that we really have to think about is how do we complement, right? How does the human element complement the machine element? Speaking, in terms of, the medical field, right? And for some reasons this isn't working because so often we just throw, and this is just not medical, this is not journalism, we throw technology at it, right? So like, oh, AI is the hottest thing. We got to be in on AI. We got to get these tools. It's like, well, what are we doing with this? And I think another point to kind of bring out here is that so often we talk about AI in journalism, and I know we have a lot of computer scientists here who are probably cringing, being like, I think what they're talking about is not AI. And that's a whole different discussion too, right? But I think moving forward, one of the things we need to think about is what types of AI I'm just going to put the AI in quotes, what types of AI are we talking about? Because, what Amanda just brought up is, how does, when we're using automated story generation, right? And then how do we bring in the human journalist, right? That's different than, how do we, think about, using information about audience metrics at the editor level. And so I think what needs to happen is we really need to start, and I'm not saying people aren't doing this, people are, but in scholars especially start talking about AI so broadly and start honing in on, are we talking about AI and audience metrics? Are we talking about A/B testing? Are we, and that to really get to kind of a meaningful place with all of this.
I think those are great points. Oh, go ahead.
No, sorry, I was just gonna pick up on Andrea's point, which is I think that AI is a tricky catch-all term when really what we mean is technology. And I think that AI itself, even when we're really talking about it, isn't so clearly defined. But for me, I think about AI as really sophisticated prediction technologies, usually ones that we have trained. Right. And so like the AI generated stories at Bloomberg, business stories or sports stories, are really sophisticated Mad Libs, right? In a sense, they're less about finding the meaning because, as I think Amanda just pointed out, that's not easy for them to do. But we see in various parts of technology where things can generate content, whether that is recommendations or whether it's literally images or deepfakes or whatever, that once you train something with enough useful inputs, it becomes quite good, very impressive anyway, at generating other things that didn't exist previously. And I think that to the original question, we have given technology lots of useful training data for certain tasks, right? So you unleash a, chatbot AI on Twitter and it turns into a racist in like 8 hours or whatever, right? You train the TikTok recommendation algorithm and it can just start sending you, Nazi content or vaccine misinformation. It's really easy when you train it that way for it to give you that back. We haven't invested nearly as much time in taking intelligent journalist inputs and training our algorithms on those things, right? One of my biggest frustrations in both reporting on and talking to the folks at Facebook who are trying to deal with newsfeed integrity is that there aren't really any journalists working there, right? There's a bunch of computer scientists who think we can, every algorithm is our hammer and misinformation is the nail, right? And so they're not really thinking with the investigative eye that journalists are like, wait, I can see an obvious pattern here when I look at it. And if you just remodeled your algorithm in this way or trained it to look at things this way, you might be much better at it. When I spoke to the folks at TikTok and said to them, look, you guys are doing a horrible job getting rid of misinformation on your platform. And I know, but you're really good at finding it because I spent a day training a new account on your algorithm and it gives me nothing but misinformation. Why haven't you done that? So the ways that the people that are building algorithms employ the insights from journalists is really the disconnect. I don't think that there's a challenge in doing it, just as maybe more time ought to be spent in the medical field getting the doctors to provide the right kinds of inputs so that their tacit knowledge is integrated.
In what Cameron said and what Amanda said, we also see this tension of the advertiser of Facebook and companies like Facebook being in the middle and creating this added tension with the focus on measurability and profitability. I'd point out that in the United States, the Institute for Nonprofit News, which is a membership organization for nonprofit news entities, had record membership this year. I'd also point out the National Trust for Local News, which is supporting efforts to buy up local newspapers to create independence from existing advertising structures, have both had some success this year in pushing back against some of these models. But to our topic of AI, I'm going to shift to our next question and flip the perspective a little bit. Lucy's making some connections in her question to a session from this morning. I'll also make a connection to a session from last night. Lucy remarked that there was a paper that was presented this morning that shows that just pointing out fake news and pointing out misinformation makes no difference to end users. If you as journalists or platforms add in choice to the readers, viewers and listeners in terms of additional sources, including true facts at the same time as publication, and not as an after effect, that can actually change patterns of consumption and also points of view. So Lucy's asking if you could all discuss measures that you would suggest to support consumers and really to support hard to reach people who may have gone down the rabbit hole. And I would add to that from a panel that we had yesterday on misinformation, there was added discussion about the challenges that we have as we look across demographics, particularly as you get towards either the younger end or the older end of the spectrum in breaking through, pulling people out of the rabbit hole, but also breaking through this wall of misinformation. So are there measures, are there tools that we can give to consumers to help them to better understand what they are reading? And do we need to help them to understand that what they're reading may be automatically generated or automatically written?
I say, I think the elephant in the room here is that this is a lot of the problem is not about AI or new technology. It's very old technology, old media platforms, particularly in the United States, that no longer adhere to some basic principles of news reporting. So the simplest way of getting to hard to reach people would be for those platforms that talk to those hard to reach people to frankly up their ethical standards. It's not a complicated technology driven approach. It's a journalistic ethical approach.
Okay. I can see the perspective. I'm curious. So, are there for the lay audience? So, are there tools? Are there ways that we can enhance understanding of what's being consumed? Are there indicators that we can give to? I'm just trying to push on the question that's being asked. Are there tools that we can give to the audience in terms of technology that might help? Yeah, Amanda.
So I'll just mention two things. This Kate Crawford had an art exhibit last fall. It was an online art exhibit about how the sausage making machine that is the internet today. And I meet a lot of people, including both young and old people, who don't understand that if you click on something on the web, the computer writes that down and then tries to give you more things. I literally had someone ask me once why they see so many stories about Kim Kardashian. I was like, do you click on them? And they said yes. And I'm like, well, that's your problem. And they didn't get it. So people click on something out of curiosity. Some wild, outlandish, an alien landed on Main Street, and they'll click on it just because for fun, not realizing that that's going to generate a lot more of that. And so I think if we could do more creative artwork like what Kate Crawford did last year, that would be phenomenal. There's also online news organizations that will provide you facts alongside a story, like Snopes, which is significantly underfunded, and ProPublica and other news organizations. I know the BBC does some of this that just, as you're reading this story, yes, it's here, and also here are the facts. The risk with that is that we know that people, even if people understand that something is false, once it's in your brain, it sort of stays there. So the more we cover, in some sense, the more that we cover, even using AI to augment it, the more that we cover fake information or misinformation, the more it will stay in people's minds. And then it'll sort of rise up in the middle of the night and seem to them as true. So there's a sort of a rhetorical question here about how we foreground the truthful information, how we get the AI to foreground the truthful information versus the fake information.
We get this question about how do you solve this problem every day? And so frustratingly, there aren't, in my opinion, great answers, but the one that I think about the most is, broadly speaking, what you could call media literacy, right? That people, we don't have the level of media literacy we need, and that's the starting point from which all the other solutions can grow. So when you see something problematic on the internet and you're not sure if it's true or not, your first instinct should be to investigate it, right? And that maybe starts with Google or whatever your means of investigation is, but most people don't, right? Most people take it as a fact. In addition, there is this subset of the population who are really deep into the world of conspiracy theory and misinformation, and for them, things are a little bit different. What we've observed is that they are not passive consumers of junk content. They are active investigators, right? So they're actually applying the same kind of methodologies and approaches that journalists apply, but in this weird and misguided direction, right? So recognizing that those people are actually, they have a tremendous appetite for investigation and learning, right? They are primed for the high quality media literacy, but are just headed in the wrong direction. I think that we need to sort of recognize that there are these different forms that people are, that are creating the conditions where people fall into these rabbit holes. And one of them is this high interest investigative personality, and they need to be sort of addressed in one way, and those who don't have media literacy addressed in another way. But really, it all comes back to what extent we are working not just on educating people about this thing is true and this thing is false. Like, I love Snopes and PolitiFact and all of those things, and I think they form a critical function. But at its core, news media needs to be reinforcing the idea that people need to be critical and thinking for themselves. Because as soon as you take something that maybe is marginally questionable and you dig just an inch down, you can find something that's much more useful that will help you inoculate you from future instances of that piece of problematic content.
I want to add here, and I see Lucy just put this in the chat, that media literacy only goes so far. And in fact, some research has shown that, it can't go far enough. And I think, there's another factor here in that, what we're dealing with is a larger social issue. And here I'm going to be very US specific. I'm sorry for my European counterparts, but there's a mistrust of not just, the news media, but a mistrust, for example, of, academics, of doctors. I mean, we had people actively, being aggressive to healthcare workers here in the United States. And I know that's happened in other places. And I know that's not the question, but I think, thinking in terms of, Rory did say, talking directly, I think, toward, Fox News. But, the fact is we do have high, partisan media here in the United States. We try to pretend it's not, but it is. And not only that, we also have groups that people belong to, be it civic, be it religious, be it, whatever, that are also kind of a part of this and supporting it. And so I think the media do have a responsibility to think about these issues. And I think media literacy is important, but this is kind of a all hands on deck type of situation. And I can give you a perfect example of that. I interview people about their conceptualizations of artificial intelligence in journalism, and ideas of trust, and ideas of, the media and its quality. And I've had people tell me, what do you think about, algorithms, or what do you think about, technology writing a news story? And they're like, well, I don't know. It depends. Who owns the technology? Is it Fox News? Well, if it's Fox News' algorithm, I'll believe it. But if it's MSNBC's, it's not. And these are, in some ways, I don't want to go back to older issues, because I think it's also important to note that there's a technological component here, and the tricky widget is bringing the social with the technological component on this. I would like to say, because I know we do have some journalists watching here, is like, yes, we do have journalists who are debunking myths. But I think a big problem in news coverage, and I'm going to just segue a little bit away here from technology because it's important, is, the other day I saw a headline to the effect of, talking about the one woman that was killed here in the January 6th uprising. And, it says to some people, the headline to the effect was the effect of, to some people, so-and-so, is, was attacking the Capitol, but to other people, she's now a martyr. And the entire story was about, how do we see a person who's killed in this Capitol uprising? And that's an important story, but the way it was presented made both viewpoints seem equal. And a continuous problem, we can talk about technology, we can talk about how, this information is disseminated, but there's also coverage going on here. And I'll just kind of leave that at that. And one point I would like to make about artificial intelligence, and we have not had a chance to hit on, and Matt, you kind of alluded to this, is like, we also need to be more transparent, and transparent in meaningful ways, about how we are using artificial intelligence, and what exactly do we mean by artificial intelligence, and the fact that a technology is writing the story, and what does that mean? So I kind of answered a few different questions in there.
And with that, we're going to wind down the panel because we've run a little bit over on time. But we have kind of come full circle from talking about the impact of the technology to the role of the audience and the role of media literacy. And I think haphazardly, we have made our way fully around in exploring the role of artificial intelligence in news media today. So I'm really grateful for the way that our panelists have handled the questions and engaged in discussion with one another and with me and with the audience. So thank you for your time and for your comments today. Also want to note that as we were winding down today, we're talking about some questions of polarization, of controversy, and of the way in which AI in some ways amplifies some of the extreme conversations, extreme point of views that we see on the web today. And with that, I would point you towards the paper session that's coming up in 10 minutes on extremism, polarization, and controversy, the new reality of the web. So keep that in mind. Check in 10 minutes to attend that. And with that, I want to thank Rory, Andrea, Cameron, and Amanda for their time today. Please join me in giving them a round of applause. Our thanks for being here today, and thank you to our audience. With that, we will see you shortly for the next paper session.